The billionaire had just laughed in a single father's face and called him a nobody when her daughter suddenly ran across the crowded charity hall, threw her arms around the man's waist, and cried, "That's him. He's the man who saved my life." The laughter died instantly. The woman who had spent years believing money could protect her from every danger stared at the stranger in a worn jacket, and then her eyes fell upon the faded tattoo on his wrist. Her breath caught. She had seen that insignia before, in a photograph buried inside an old military report about the day her daughter nearly died. If you believe kindness can heal what money cannot, that forgiveness can change a life, and that everyone deserves hope and a second chance, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel, because sometimes the person we judge the fastest is the person who has been carrying the heaviest burden. The man standing beneath the crystal chandeliers was named Everett Cole, a 38-year-old single father who had learned to live quietly after a life that had once been anything but quiet. He worked maintenance and security at a private community center on the edge of the city, repaired broken doors, carried boxes, fixed leaking pipes, and picked up his 8-year-old daughter, Maisie, from school every afternoon. His clothes were clean but inexpensive, his shoes were worn, and his old pickup truck had more miles on it than most people would have believed possible. Everett never complained. He had learned long ago that dignity did not come from what a person owned. It came from what a person refused to become after losing everything. Across the room stood Celeste Whitmore, one of the wealthiest women in the country, whose foundation had organized the charity event that afternoon. Celeste had built a financial empire after inheriting a struggling family company and transforming it into a global investment firm. The newspapers called her brilliant, ruthless, fearless, and untouchable. She wore confidence like armor, but beneath it lived a mother who had spent 8 years terrified of losing her only child. Her daughter, Brielle, was 11, intelligent and sensitive, but after a traumatic accident when she was 3, she had become fearful around strangers and especially uncomfortable in crowded places. Celeste had surrounded her with doctors, tutors, therapists, assistants, and security professionals. What she could not buy was the simple peace of knowing her daughter was safe. Everett had been hired that afternoon to help with the event because several members of the regular security team had called out unexpectedly. He stood near a service entrance, quietly making sure guests did not wander into restricted areas while keeping one eye on Maisie, who had been allowed to accompany him because he had no childcare available. He had no intention of speaking to Celeste Whitmore. He knew who she was, and he had no interest in becoming another employee begging for her attention. But Celeste noticed him when he stepped into the main hall carrying a stack of folding chairs. One of her assistants had complained about a misplaced table, and Everett had calmly moved it himself rather than waiting for instructions. Celeste watched him for a moment before dismissing him as another temporary worker who would disappear once the event ended. Later, when Everett accidentally crossed near the VIP area, Celeste stopped him with a sharp glance. She asked whether he understood that the guests in that section had been carefully selected and that staff members were expected to remain invisible. Everett apologized without arguing and moved away. A few minutes later, a wealthy donor noticed Maisie sitting alone at a nearby table while Everett helped an elderly guest find the restroom. The donor assumed she was another guest's child and smiled at her, but Maisie simply looked toward her father. Celeste noticed the interaction and grew irritated. She approached Everett and reminded him that bringing personal family matters into a private charity event was inappropriate. Everett explained quietly that his daughter had nowhere else to go that afternoon and that he would keep her out of everyone's way. Celeste looked at his worn jacket, his old watch, and his battered shoes, then made the mistake that would haunt her for years. She told him that people like him should understand that certain rooms were not meant for them. Everett's face remained calm, but something behind his eyes changed. He had heard worse words in worse places. He simply nodded, took Maisie's hand, and began walking toward the service corridor. He did not defend himself. He did not insult Celeste. He did not ask for another chance. His silence somehow made her words feel uglier. Then the building's fire alarm screamed. Everything happened within seconds. A malfunctioning electrical panel in the catering area sent smoke into the hallway, and guests began moving toward the exits. Security personnel rushed in different directions. Celeste immediately searched for Brielle, who had been standing beside a decorative staircase. She was gone. Panic tore through the billionaire's carefully controlled world. Celeste pushed through the crowd calling for her daughter while employees shouted conflicting instructions. The smoke was not thick enough to be immediately life-threatening, but it reduced visibility, and the emergency doors had automatically locked certain interior corridors. Celeste tried to enter a restricted hallway, but a security guard stopped her because part of the ceiling had begun shedding debris. Then she saw Everett. He was already moving. He had abandoned the service corridor and was heading toward the old West Wing, the one area most guests did not know existed. His movements were strangely controlled. While everyone else was running with panic, Everett seemed to be calculating distance, exits, air movement, and structural hazards. He grabbed a fire extinguisher, checked the corridor, and disappeared through a maintenance door. Celeste screamed her daughter's name. Seconds passed. Then more seconds. The crowd grew silent when a figure emerged from the smoke carrying a small girl in his arms. It was Brielle. Her face was streaked with tears, and one sleeve of her dress was torn, but she was alive. Everett carried her with astonishing gentleness. He lowered himself to one knee and handed her to Celeste, making certain the child was breathing normally before stepping away. Celeste grabbed her daughter and held her so tightly that Brielle could barely move. She wanted to thank him. She wanted to apologize. But before she could speak, Brielle pulled away from her mother's arms and ran back toward Everett. The child wrapped both arms around his waist. Celeste froze. Brielle had never willingly embraced a stranger during a frightening situation. She had spent years avoiding unfamiliar people, yet she clung to Everett as if she had known him forever. Then Brielle looked at her mother and revealed the secret that shattered everything Celeste thought she knew. She told her that Everett was the man from the photograph. Celeste stared at him. Everett looked away. Her mind raced backward 8 years, to the accident that had nearly taken Brielle from her. At the time, Celeste had been told that an unidentified former military responder had pulled her daughter from a wrecked vehicle after a highway collision. The man had refused recognition, left before the family could thank him, and disappeared into the chaos of the rescue operation. Celeste had searched through reports but had never learned his name. Now she looked at the faded tattoo on Everett's wrist. A naval insignia. Her heart began pounding. Celeste asked him who he was. Everett hesitated before finally telling her that he had once served as a Navy SEAL. He had been part of a specialized rescue team that happened to be passing through the area when the accident occurred. He had heard a child's cry inside the wreckage, crawled through twisted metal, freed Brielle from her damaged seat, and stayed with her until paramedics arrived. Celeste could hardly breathe. She suddenly remembered a detail from the old report. The rescuer had suffered a serious shoulder injury while pulling the child free. The report had said he refused medical treatment until the child was stabilized. She looked at Everett's shoulder. He still moved it slightly differently. The man she had mocked as a nobody had been the stranger who had saved her daughter's life. But the revelation became even more painful when Celeste learned why Everett had left the military. His final deployment had ended with the death of several members of his unit. Everett survived, but survival had not felt like victory. After leaving the SEALs, he struggled to adjust to ordinary life. He married young, hoping family life would help him rebuild. For a while, it did. Then his wife died from an illness, leaving Everett alone with Maisie when she was barely 4. He could have returned to contracting work for enormous amounts of money. Instead, he chose to raise his daughter himself. He wanted her to know that strength was not always about fighting. Sometimes strength meant making breakfast when your heart was broken. Sometimes it meant working an ordinary job without bitterness. Sometimes it meant choosing kindness when nobody was watching. Celeste listened as Everett explained that he had never told anyone about saving Brielle because he did not believe saving a child should become a debt another person had to repay. He had simply done what he believed was right. Celeste felt ashamed. She remembered every word she had spoken to him earlier that afternoon. She had judged his clothes. She had judged his job. She had judged his circumstances. And she had completely missed the character of the man standing in front of her. But Everett did not humiliate her. He simply told her that wealth and poverty were temporary conditions, while character was something a person carried everywhere. Those words stayed with Celeste. Over the following weeks, she began quietly investigating Everett's story, not because she doubted him, but because she wanted to understand the man she had treated so poorly. Every record confirmed what he had said. His military service was decorated. His rescue had been documented. His sacrifice was real. Yet what affected Celeste most was not the medals. It was what she saw when she visited the community center. Everett was helping children repair bicycles. He was teaching teenagers basic emergency preparedness. He was fixing a broken wheelchair ramp for an elderly woman who could not afford repairs. He was using his lunch break to help a frightened child find her missing backpack. Nobody there knew about his military past. Nobody treated him like a hero. And Everett seemed perfectly comfortable with that. Celeste began changing too. She started spending less time in executive meetings that did not matter and more time with Brielle. She listened when her daughter talked instead of immediately arranging another specialist. She learned that Brielle remembered Everett not because he had been a decorated soldier, but because he had spoken calmly to her inside the wreckage and promised that he would not leave until she was safe. Celeste also began spending time with Maisie. At first, Everett was cautious. He did not trust easily, and he had no desire to become dependent on a billionaire's generosity. Celeste understood that. Instead of offering him money, she offered respect. She eventually admitted that she had spent years believing she could protect Brielle by controlling everything around her. She had mistaken control for love. Everett told her gently that fear could make even good people build walls so high that nobody could reach them. Celeste cried when he said it. Not because he was cruel. Because he was right. Their relationship developed slowly, without grand promises or instant romance. Celeste began to see Everett not as the poor single father she had once dismissed, but as a man who had endured loss without allowing it to turn him cold. Everett began to see Celeste not as the arrogant billionaire he had first encountered, but as a frightened mother learning how to put down the armor she had worn for years. Brielle and Maisie became close friends, and their laughter gradually filled spaces that had once felt painfully empty. Months later, Celeste stood at the community center during a daytime dedication ceremony for a new youth emergency training program. She had funded it, but she insisted Everett's name not appear above the entrance. Instead, the building carried the simple words, "For those who choose to help." Everett stood beside her, holding Maisie's hand. Brielle stepped onto the small platform and looked at the crowd. She said that heroes were not always the people with expensive houses or impressive titles. Sometimes heroes were people who stayed when everyone else ran. Sometimes they were fathers who worked ordinary jobs. Sometimes they were mothers who learned to admit when they were wrong. And sometimes the greatest rescue was not pulling someone from a burning building, but teaching them that they were worth saving. Celeste wiped away a tear. Everett squeezed her hand. The woman who had once mocked him now stood beside him with no concern for what anyone thought. She had finally learned that a person's value could never be measured by their bank account, their clothes, their job, or their social position. And Everett had learned something too. Not every wealthy person was heartless. Not every wounded heart was destined to remain guarded. Some people really could change. Some apologies were genuine. Some second chances were worth taking. Years earlier, Everett had pulled a little girl from twisted metal and disappeared before anyone could thank him. He had believed that moment was over. He had been wrong. Because sometimes the lives we save return to save us in ways we never expect. Sometimes one act of courage creates a chain of kindness that reaches far beyond the moment itself. And sometimes the person standing in front of us is carrying a story we cannot see. So before you judge someone by what they wear, what they drive, where they work, or what they can afford, remember Everett Cole. Remember the billionaire who learned that money could purchase protection but never character, and remember the single father who proved that a hero does not need an audience to be heroic. Before we reach the end, I want to ask you something. If you were in Celeste's position, what would you have done after discovering that the man you had humiliated was the person who once saved your child? Leave a meaningful comment and tell us what lesson this story gave you, because your words might give hope to someone reading them today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And always remember, kindness costs nothing, forgiveness can change everything, and sometimes the greatest second chance begins with simply having the courage to admit that we were wrong.